Welcome to the Social Impact Level Up podcast. This is where we blur the lines between business, nonprofit, and impact. I'm your host, Wendie V, and in season 3, we're redefining success for social entrepreneurs looking to grow their revenue. If you have reality-changing ideas, this is the place for you. Let's jump right into today's episode. Have you been wondering how you can use marketing to fuel your social entrepreneurship? Well, there are a lot of different ways, and our guest today is going to tell us all about it. I'm your host, Wendie B, and I have Eric Ressler here, and he is going to spill the beans on how we can market ourselves better. So, Eric, I want you to introduce yourself first. Can you tell us who are you and how do you make an impact?
Sure. I'm Eric Ressler. I'm the founder and creative director at Cosmic, and Cosmic is a social impact creative agency. So we work with nonprofits, social enterprises, funders, organizations that exist at their core to move humanity forward in one way or another. And we've been around for about 15 years, focused on social impact for about 8 at this point.
That's so cool. And you yourself are a social entrepreneur by definition, sort of.
Yeah, in a kind of roundabout way, right? So our impact happens through helping our clients make more impact. So we're a little bit more upstream, almost similar to like a funder might be.
Yeah, exactly. Like my business as well, coaching these folks through these processes. It's like we're almost like the safety net for the do-gooders, I feel like. Yeah, and giving all the secrets on how to do good and continue doing good in a sustainable way. So I'm excited to have you here on the show. And I'm curious, just to start out the conversation, what is the biggest thing that you see people maybe missing the mark on or doing not so hot in their marketing that's causing some strife?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can frame this in a bigger way, which is that we're really trying to beat the drum around this distinction between what we refer to as a brand building approach to marketing and a more transactional approach to marketing. And I think there's been a shift more broadly that's spilling over into social impact organizations around marketing becoming so much more transactional. And I think a lot of that is because technology has given us a lot more data to work with from a marketing perspective around engagement and analytics and some of these things. And so marketers are now trained to measure impact based on numbers and data around conversions, around impressions, around reach, all of these kind of signals of engagement. And I think those signals are important to look at. But I think the bigger trend is that we're losing sight of what is the purpose of doing brand marketing in the first place. And the purpose of that really at the end of the day is to forge deeper relationships and to build community. And so if all you're doing all day is looking at numbers, but you're losing sight of the bigger impact and the bigger signals of impact, such as relationship building, community building, growth, revenue, some of those things, then you're not measuring the right things, and what you measure matters. So I think that's one big thing that we're seeing. I think another big thing that we're seeing is a lot of investment in content production and creation, because content is king in marketing and in our digital first world, but not enough time spent figuring out how to best package that marketing and that content. So, publishing posts, publishing videos, but not spending enough time on how to package and how to distribute that content to squeeze the most value out of it. So those are two kind of big things that we see all the time. Of course, there's many others, but we could dig into those.
Yeah, and I think you're hitting the nail on the head of what, especially a startup organization in the social impact space is thinking. Well, how do I position myself with my impact mission, my profit mission? Obviously, profit mission driving the organization's ability to do more impact, but then the marketing is the kind of like hidden piece that can really support all of these. But if you're sort of not, I guess, using them together in the right way, you could go awry really easily.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and there's so many ways that could go wrong. So often what we see is a lot of organizations focused on mission, and that's great. That's a great inclination. But you also need to focus on communication and around spreading the word around how your mission is actually moving forward, especially to your supporters that already are supporting you, so that they know that their investment, whether they're a donor for a nonprofit or they're a customer of a more product or market-focused organization, the social enterprise, donors and supporters of your mission, however they're supporting you, they want to know that you're making a difference, right? And so if you're keeping all of your impact tucked away as a secret, that is a huge mistake. Like, we need to communicate. And so marketing at the end of the day is really about communication. It's not necessarily just about selling. It's about building awareness, but it's also about educating, about inspiring, telling stories of hope, stories of success. So I think if you're not investing properly, we really see it as like a pillar of a successful social impact organization alongside all the program work that you're doing, alongside all of the strategic work that you're doing and everything else that you're doing. And so if that piece is missing completely or not being invested in properly, then it's really holding everything else back. So there's so much to talk about with that, but I think that's the
yes. No, I can give you a living example. When I was in the federal government, one of the technical assistance groups we would often invest in is every project had evaluation and marketing along with our main programmatic technical assistants and the federal team. So when you had to package all that together, we knew to create a sustainable program. But if the organizations couldn't do all those things, they were not going to be sustainable. If we couldn't guide them to do all those things, they were not going to be sustainable. So it was kind of like you have to invest in this communications piece in order to either prompt more change, or once funding ends or once something changes, to have people go along with you to whatever that next iteration of your thing is. And I think that people forget that, sustainability is really a communications plan as well.
Right. And I think the thing that we see a lot of times is that especially early stage organizations, they don't have internal expertise or capacity to do this on their own, right? So they have to bring external teams in either for strategy or execution, creative execution, implementation, evaluation, all those pieces. And that's totally fine as long as you can find partners who can do that effectively and do that in a way that's fully integrated. Because if all of this work is just siloed, it doesn't work either, right? So if you think about even just an example of like fundraising being a silo and marketing being a silo, and they're not talking to each other, both of those things are going to be held back, right?
Yeah, and then they have no outcomes information either at the same time.
Right. And again, back to the earlier part of the discussion, like what are you measuring? Are you measuring engagement signals? Like, yes, you should be measuring that, but are you connecting those back to bigger business goals like growth around revenue, growth around customers, or around donations, or donor retention? Like those are the signals and the real true pieces that you should be measuring at the end of the day, and showing that your overall marketing program is supporting that and driving that. Not necessarily any one individual post or piece, because I think that's the other big mistake we make is we look at what's the engagement of this one post or the engagement of this one podcast episode. And, there's always going to be some noise in those signals. So you have to give this work time to play out. So you should be measuring in months, not days or hours, and then looking at the package as a whole, because there's always going to be some level of, you can, even with all the data we have today, there's still some amount of this that you can't measure. Word of mouth, things happening in private Slack channels, right? There's this kind of whole quote unquote like dark social component to this where we can't measure it. And then on top of that, a lot of the automated attribution software that we have is actually like wildly inaccurate. So for example, someone may hear about this podcast episode because someone listened and told their friend, and they went on Google and searched for the episode. And then, the attribution in whatever marketing software you're using is going to say, oh, this was organic search or paid search, when actually it was word of mouth, right? So you have to look at all this data and then interpret it as a human and not just like a robot.
Want to amplify your impact today? Join my community, the Social Impact Level Up Collective, where social entrepreneurs just like you meet monthly to inspire world-changing ideas. You'll get access to my top courses and resources, speakers, and exclusive community events. Hop in right now at wendievelos.com/collective. And I think a lot of small organizations don't have, one, the budget to sometimes pay consultants to come help them, two, the ability to build the websites and the online presence, social media presence that they want to have a solid brand. And then three, once they get to there, the consistency of posting over time and creating the content and the strategy, like it's so hard. I know even as a small business, it's so hard to get all that down. And even coaching people through that and helping them with that process, it's hard for people to wrap their brain around what you just mentioned. So I wanted to speak into that you're so exactly hit the nail on the head with this one of what's needed. So if you're a small organization and you're struggling through any one of those pieces of the process, like, how do you just start if you can't pay someone like you to come in and help with that? Like, what's one action someone can do to really help themselves at this point?
Yeah. So if you're really constrained by resources or time, and what I would say is like everyone feels that way, no matter where you are in your journey. Even if you have an in-house team of like 5 full-time content creators and marketers, you're still going to feel constrained. So, you have to figure out where you are in that journey. What I would say is that if we skip some of the foundational things that need to be in place, such as like having a clear mission and vision, having a clear niche, good like core messaging, because that has to happen before good content work can happen. But I want to answer your question more directly. So I want to skip all of that. What I would say the biggest thing, there's 2 really big things that come to mind for me. One is going back to that concept of learning how can you actually craft content that's scroll stopping, that breaks through in our world where so much of what we see is driven by algorithms and their preferences, right? So whether you're in a social media channel or even email to some degree these days, because our inboxes are so noisy. So you should spend roughly 50% of your time on content creation, crafting your subject line, and then 50% on the email itself, as just an example. And I think what the big mistake is, most people, and I'm totally, guilty of this at times before, I'm trying to take my own advice here. You'll spend 95% of your time writing the email, and then right before you send it, you're like, oh, we need a subject line and a preview text and a hook for the email. And really, like when you think about it more deeply, if no one clicks the email, it doesn't even matter what's in it, right? So, and that's just one example. But if you think about that packaging and framing of the content for anything, so like this podcast or a video that you make or a report or an article that you write, you have to figure out how you can package content in a way that actually stops people on their scroll, gets them to pay attention and to engage. I'll briefly just share some tips on that, and then I can talk about the second main pillar. So the main thing around crafting hooks that work are, and you've seen this taken to the extreme, this is clickbait, right? Where there's this curiosity gap. You say some kind of something that's like shocking or controversial, or you kind of like create this open loop, and it kind of hacks your human psychology. You're like, I just have to see what the answer to this is, even if I don't really care about it, right? So that's like clickbait to the extreme. But some of those same principles can be used responsibly and skillfully to capture people's attention, to make it more likely that they'll actually engage in whatever piece of content that you have. So some really high level tips: create hooks that create a curiosity gap, make people want to stop, and also have some sort of emotional appeal, right? That actually kind of tap into emotions. So, there's all kinds of different emotions. Fear is one that works quite well, but should not be overused, or you just start to get really negative. So even like fear of missing out, like, oh, I just want to know what's in here, right? But also like desire, like I want to learn about this interesting topic. I'm curious about the perspectives of this podcast or this piece of content or whatever it is. So the packaging, how do you frame all that up, is really, really important. So that's like one big piece that can make your content efforts more effective and more efficient, so that any given piece of content you are spending time and energy creating has significantly more likelihood of actually breaking through and getting engagement. So that's one side. The second side is what I would refer to as essentially like a distribution first approach to content creation. So again, rather than saying, okay, we're going to write an article and then we're going to promote that article, you really need to kind of reverse engineer that. So understanding like who is the audience for this given piece of content, what is kind of the content pillar that this fits within, and ideally you've identified like a few key content pillars that you really want to hit. And by content pillar, I'm talking not necessarily about like formats as much as like concepts or ideas. So like one of our content pillars is about the attention economy, which is like a very big idea that a lot of our content supports, but it could be a blog post, it could be a podcast, it could be a video, et cetera, et cetera. And with a distribution first approach, what you're really looking at is like, who is this piece of content for? What are the channels that we know that audience tends to hang out in? And then what are the formats that work well in that channel? So for example, if one of the key channels is email, it doesn't make sense to create a short form vertical video because you can't put that in an email, right? On the flip side, if one of the key channels is TikTok, then you should absolutely be doing short form vertical video because that is the key format for TikTok. And then you start to back that into, okay, so here's the channels, here's the audiences, here's the channels they hang out in, here's the pillar this is about. What does that mean in terms of what is the content we should actually be creating in the first place? So it can really inform even what content you create, what ideas are going to work. So it's like kind of a reverse engineered approach to that. And then the other thing I would say about distribution first is that it's really about how can you get the most out of any piece of content effort that you're creating. So things like if it is a long form thing like this podcast, for example, can we chop it up into short segments that get dripped out over, a couple of weeks? Can we break it down into a transcript and an article so that if someone wants to, consume it that way? So just like squeezing the most out of any piece of content that you're creating. So these are just some high level ideas around how to be efficient and effective with content production.
Man, I feel like a marketing guru right now because I am like knee deep in all of that. And I was like, oh man, this feels so rewarding to know that I'm doing it correctly, because you really feel like you're just spaghetti on the wall trying things. And in some ways, with obviously you need to test hooks, test messages, test your call to actions, test buttons. Like there's so many things we're testing as trying to market an organization or what we're doing. But some of it also is just how you describe what's aligned with your values and your organization. And some of that is not, I've noticed this, it doesn't always translate when you just give it over to a digital marketing company. Like you really have to have them understand your organization and your services at a deeper level. And I know that you go through that process of deep understanding, but not every other digital marketing company does. Can you describe that so people maybe understand what they should be purchasing or what they should be expecting in that process?
Yeah, definitely. So here's a couple thoughts. One is that another common mistake that I think will inform the rest of this answer is, especially when you're first getting started, feeling like you have to be everywhere. Like you do not have to be everywhere. Again, thinking about who are your audiences, where do they actually hang out, and like pick a channel or two and just like really focus your efforts on nailing that channel, because every channel has its own culture essentially around what people expect, what formats and approaches work. And like, of course, you can try and do stuff that's different, and that can be a really great strategy. Like if everyone's zigging, maybe you can zag or vice versa, right? But you need to at least understand the culture. And if you're trying to do, especially with limited resources, if you're trying to kind of be everywhere, you're going to end up spreading yourself too thin. You're not going to have time to like really even like evaluate what's working and experiment, all that stuff. So that's one thing. I think that leads to the answer to this question, because it's also, okay, if I want to bring on external support for this work, how do I do that? So first of all, I think it's totally viable to do that. We do that, even though we have a lot of internal expertise and capacity on doing this kind of work. Like we have partners that we bring on for some of our own content production. But you need to think about it like a partnership and not a delegation. Like that's the big thing. Because if you think about it like, okay, we're going to like hire this marketing team and they're just going to take this off our plate, you can do that and you will get content out of it, but it will not likely break through and will not likely achieve the like deeper results that you're looking for. And so the way that I would view bringing on any kind of external consultant would be, how can we partner on this work together? Because at the end of the day, especially if we're talking about, social impact organizations, like you have expertise and lived experience. That is the gold nugget that you need to share through your content. And you cannot bring someone on to replicate that. You can bring someone on to help with your content strategy, your creative execution of that content, the distribution, the editorial calendar. Like people can do all those different parts, but the idea generation, the stories, the opportunities, that needs to live inside your organization and be given to your partners as essentially ammunition or fuel to fuel the rest of your content work.
Yeah, it's sort of like this, on top of all the other basic foundations that you were just talking about, that understanding your mission, understanding your content pillars, like having gone through a lot of those pieces, you could also use the support to develop those if you don't have them. But once you have them and you're like rocking and rolling and going forward, it is the churn in some ways that people get behind the scenes and like, oh, yeah. I can get this podcast episode edited, and then I can't get it out, and then I can't do the shorts, and it sort of everything cycles in between the time. So how do you, I guess, recommend people maybe better manage their time around marketing, or spend the appropriate amount of time, I guess, because you could spend all your time and still not see a return, to be honest.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a really dependent, like the answer to that question is very dependent on where you are as an organization. And I think what tends to happen is when you're first getting started with this, it's going to take up a lot of time and energy to do it well, because you need to do some of these bigger picture brainstorms around like, well, who are the audiences we're actually trying to reach? Like deeply thinking about that, understanding like, again, what are the right channels? What are the right formats? Doing some of this experimentation, building out the workflows. So it's like spinning up an entire new arm to your business, essentially. So that's it takes a lot of time to do anything like that well, of course. And then ideally you start to get into a flow where it's not necessarily on autopilot. I don't want to overpromise that, but you build out these workflows, you have some of these decisions made. You do need to give stuff time to, play out and test and iterate on it, but you are also always experimenting, evaluating, ideating on new things. So it's never fully done, but it feels more established, like a workflow or a machine after a certain amount of time. And then it might be time to expand or scale that program up. It might be time to iterate on that. So you've given, TikTok 6 months and you're just not breaking through there. Your audience just isn't there. Great. Take it off the list, reallocate that energy into some of the other channels that are working, for example. So what's the exact right amount of time? I don't even know how to answer that because it's so dependent on, the size of the organization. Like if you're a CMO or equivalent or, a head of marketing and communications at a nonprofit, I mean, this is your entire day, all day, every day, right? Essentially playing editor in chief within your organization, gathering ideas, managing other teams, putting out content, doing some evaluation. If you're the executive director, I don't know what percentage of your time should be spent on this, but in my opinion, some of it should, at least participating in the overall process with other team members.
Yeah, or setting the tone and direction for, the strategy before the people actually develop the strategies to execute. So yeah, I appreciate that. And I think that you reminded me of one other question that I really wanted to ask you, which is when you're at the sort of end of something, I think I hear this from a lot of clients, especially coalitions and partnerships, who get to the end of a grant and then they realize that they did not communicate their successes. They stayed the best kept secret for the last 5-10 years. And then it's time to do something that's going to be sustainable, ideally get some more supporters and money in the door to take over for the funding that they're losing. So what could you say to folks who find themselves in that predicament of how marketing maybe could support even upstream or at that crisis point, what they're trying to do to continue to maintain the work that they were doing under a funding stream that's no longer available?
Yeah. Well, so the first thing I'll say is that funders need to start building budget in for communications because it's hard. Or funders need to really be more willing to support organizations with general operating funds so they can spin up their own marketing and communications programs. Because I think what often happens is for certain organizations, almost all of their funds are restricted to specific grants or programs, which doesn't give them enough, general operating cash to invest in the organization, in their own team, into marketing and communications. So we have to ideally do both, right? So have organizations be more fully funded and funded to the right degree to really reach their true impact potential. And also, we need to build in communications budget into program work because it is such an important part. And, the amount is going to differ depending on what kind of program it is. If it's a public health program, a lot of it maybe should be around building a public health campaign around that program, because if no one knows about the program, they won't participate in the first place, right? So you have to right size it depending on the type of program. So I acknowledge that. But in my opinion, almost every program or grant should include a certain amount of budget for marketing, communications, and some of those elements. So if you find yourself as an organization in a place where you got to the end and you realized, oops, like we didn't communicate about this, ideally you would be doing general marketing and communications work anyway. And you could look at this as opportunities for ideas for content, right? And so going back again to that distribution first mindset, like, okay, you've got all of these different ideas. Let's reverse engineer instead of saying, okay, we have to communicate about this grant. Who's the audience? What are the channels? How can we reach them? What formats work? Okay, now look back at that content. What from that program might lend itself to these channels, to these different formats that work in these channels for these audiences? That's a high level answer.
I like the backwards engineering because I think people would normally be panicky and start saying, oh, our grant is ending, give us money for this thing, rather than saying, oh, we achieved these amazing outcomes for these kiddos or whatever we did. And would you want us to continue to do this? I think it's really flipping the script on how some of the things that have been happening in the impact sector for years of how you you're really creating more dependency in organizations versus independent organizations. So I think that's great. So the last couple of questions I want to ask you are really about you, because I'm curious. We talked all about your subject matter and all these fantastic things, but everybody who listens to this podcast knows that we dig into the actual social entrepreneur's mindset themselves. So tell me about a time that you, as an entrepreneur in your journey, have had to kind of redefine success for yourself in order to get to where you are today, or even just past a challenge that you've been faced in some way.
Yeah, it's such an interesting question because I feel like this happens all the time in different ways. So when you think about the word success, like what does that really mean? I think that's like kind of the first thing, because there's so many different ways to think about success, to measure success. In business, generally, success is about scale, about growth, about revenue. All those things are important. At the end of the day, that is important for us as well, but largely because we need, just like any social impact organization, we need the right amount of resources to do our work well. I believe very strongly in fairly compensating my team and, making sure that people are not sacrificing any more than they need to work on social impact work versus a more like standard corporate job, so to speak, or a job that's not as purposeful because they have to support their family. Like I don't want any of our team members to have to make that choice. And I know no social impact organization wants that, but I do feel like a lot of social impact organizations find themselves in that position. I would even argue that some leverage that and take advantage of it. And I think that's not right. So for me, success is really about building a truly sustainable organization. And I mean that with a capital S, sustainable. So not necessarily just environmentally, but how can we build an organization that is sustainable for me as the founder and the owner so that I don't burn out, so that I don't, get to a point where I'm not effective as a leader, I'm not treating my team well? How do I build an organization that's sustainable in terms of our workload so that we can put the right amount of time and care and intention into each of our engagements with our clients? And how can we build an organization that's sustainable in terms of actually creating an impact for our clients that actually leads them into reaching their goals, into growing their revenue, into getting more awareness and affinity for their cause? So that's how I define success at the end of the day. What that means is I'm never done, because there's always room for improvement in at least one of those places. And as the market changes and as the space changes, there's new challenges that arise all the time. So we may have solved it at one point in time, but now it comes back as a new challenge because the conditions have changed. So that's a long-winded answer to like how I look at success, but it's really not for me about growth. Like we've stayed about the same size for at least 8 years now. We've been around 9 people. That seems to be kind of like a sweet spot for us. For me, especially, I like still being part of the client work and the creative work. And my concern, if we were to grow, is that I would do less and less of that. And so I like to stay engaged there. So for us, this is a great size. And so growth looks like, yes, like we'd still like to continue to grow revenue even at our current size. And there's ways that we're doing that. But we'd also like to grow individually in terms of like developing our craft, understanding the overall social impact space and developing trends or identifying trends and developing points of view on that, as well as just like our influence in the space at large outside of our clients, even, and sharing some of our ideas and thoughts and hopefully improving the sector at large outside of our individual work with clients.
No, I love it because you're such a forward thinker. And I think our ideals align so beautifully that you literally, everything I envision from my own organization with the sustainability is a vibe, is your sustainability with a capital S, and how, you grow organically, I think, as each of us as entrepreneurs and as people in the ways that we see best for the organizations we're building. So I think that answer is perfect. And we're definitely going to be putting that out in all of the distribution channels as I think it's a great soundbite. So the last couple of questions I wanted to ask you, really touch on it a bit, but you said, the part about not burning out and you maintaining your own well-being so you can continue to show up as a leader and serve your team as they serve others, who then serve others. So this very meta sort of situation you got going on. So how do you as a person maintain your own well-being to show up and serve?
Yeah, totally. The short answer is I don't always, just to be totally transparent. So I have tactics that I use to try to do that. And I am sometimes more successful in that and sometimes not. And I think that's just the straight truth of being an entrepreneur, is that it is not always easy. And oftentimes when you see stories from entrepreneurs, you're seeing the kind of like, you're seeing it through rose-colored glasses, right? You're seeing the good things that have happened. And, I think every entrepreneur struggles in different ways. As I've reflected on my career doing this, some of the things that I've struggled with are, as much as I've been able to create a life for myself that is really, by any definition, quite awesome, and we can talk about like what that looks like, there's still times where I feel like the business is more of a ball and chain than a vehicle for my own personal freedom, right? Because I do have a lot of responsibility. I see, I've been very intentional. Like, we've never had to lay anyone off at the company, even though we've had ups and downs with revenue. I've taken on a lot of personal risk to be able to do that, but I believe it's the right thing to do. And so there is, like, authentically, logically, factually, a lot of responsibility in running a business and taking care of people, especially if you really try to take care of your team. And so sometimes that can be overwhelming, especially when times are tough or when things aren't lining up or when we're taking risks and they don't pan out. So, burnout happens. Like, there are times where I feel it happen where I'm just not as motivated. I'm not as effective. I'm not as, just like lit up about the work. And then there's times that I really am. And so for me, what I've reflected on is, like, I am a deeply creative person. That is what lights me up. Even outside of work, I'm really into, creating music, doing other creative things as well. And if I don't feel like I am creating tangible impact in a creative way, then it starts to drain me. And so I have to look for ways to do that. Even doing things like this, to me, feel creative because I'm able to share ideas, to create media that we can share. We've been working on creating our own podcast, which we've been releasing episodes on. We're releasing our 8th today, I think, of season 1. So like, that has been a very difficult project, but a super fun and creative one too. I've been able to bring my music in. Like, I wrote a lot of the soundtracks for the podcast, or all of them actually. And so, like, for me, if I can find ways to stay creative, which is funny to say because I'm our founder, but I'm also our creative director. So I'm touching all of our projects creatively, but I'm overseeing creative work more so than actually producing it myself these days within the organization. So I have to find ways where I can actually tangibly do creative work in the business and outside of the business to stay lit up and motivated.
Yeah, I think creativity does fill a lot of our cups when you're an entrepreneur, because it takes a lot of creativity and ingenuity to do this path of generating your own sort of beat from your own drum. So I appreciate you sharing all of that. And I'm so excited that you joined us. I know you have the podcast coming up. You mentioned that. But so tell folks where they can find you, and also maybe the podcast, anything, if they're interested after this episode and hearing more about what you're doing.
Sure. So our website is definitely the best place to go, designbycosmic.com. You'll find, examples of our work there. We have an insights tab that has a bunch of articles and stuff. We also have a podcast tab up at the top. The podcast is called Designing Tomorrow. You can find it, anywhere you get a podcast. We've also really invested in trying to make it like video forward as well. So we have a YouTube channel that we're trying to grow there. And the video experience is a little bit richer, but, a lot of people really love the audio experience and just like listening while they're multitasking. And so we've really done our best to try and make it accessible for either approach. So yeah, Designing Tomorrow is the podcast. Cosmic is the name of my agency, and designbycosmic.com is the URL.
Yes, and this has been Eric Ressler hanging out with us on the Social Impact Level Up podcast. Thank you so much for being here with us today. We super appreciate you and everything that you shared. And for everybody listening, thank you for being here for another episode. Thanks for listening to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed the conversation, and we look forward to having you come back. If you're curious about what we shared, make sure you check down in the show notes below. And if you're ready to grow your revenue, I have a little gift for you. Download my Revenue for Impact guidebook at wendievelos.com/guide. Until the next episode.